Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to The Truth. I'm your host, one you love the most, Niall Heston, back with a brand new episode here on The Truth. Back once again with my boy AJ Ponciano. AJ, how are you doing here today?
I'm doing great. How about yourself now?
I'm doing great as well. Today we're going to be giving you guys our Week 14 starts, sits, sleepers, and busts here for fantasy football. Another Armageddon week as far as buys are concerned. There are 6 teams on a bye. Those 6 teams are the Ravens, the Broncos, the Texans, the Colts, the Patriots, and the Commanders. So for fantasy value and fantasy relevancy, there's some teams in there that could really impact your teams, particularly the Ravens with Derrick Henry, Lamar. I would say Justin Tucker, but maybe not so much anymore. So with that team in particular and a couple other teams, like there's a lot of question marks. And I know a lot of people have had questions for me, and I know a lot of people are going to continue to have questions moving forward on, who should I start, who should I sit, who should you think is going to be a sleeper, bust, all that stuff. And that's why we got a show for you guys here today. We obviously already talked about the Thursday night game between the Packers and the Lions. So we have strictly Sunday and Monday games. It's not a Thanksgiving week, which I think I deserve a little, or we deserve a little break after a massive Thanksgiving weekend. So anyways, that's enough jibber jabbing. We're going to give you guys each our 3 starts, sits, sleepers, and busts for week 14. So, AJ, go ahead and give me your 3 starts this week.
Yeah, so my first one, I'm going to go with Evan Ingram. Essentially, the last 3 weeks, he's had Mac Jones. Last week, with that injury, that concussion to T-Law, he's basically probably going to be out for the rest of the year, from what the reports I've seen. Just kind of shut him down. They're already projected to have the number 1 pick. They're going to be bad the rest of the year. They're just not going to run him back out. The last 3 weeks, with Evan Ingram and having Mac Jones, the targets have really been there. Same with the receptions. It just really hasn't been yards and many touchdowns. He only has 1 touchdown all year, but he's had 6, 5, and 7 receptions for 40, 28, and 41 yards. And the volume's been there with targets with 8, 7, and 9. I mean, he's been getting targets. It just really hasn't been mounting to a whole lot. This being a divisional game here against the Titans, who usually don't give up a lot of yards, but they do give up a good amount of touchdowns, with 20 passing touchdowns given up to this point. I think this is a game that Evan Ingram finds his way into the end zone. Like I said, he also only has 1 touchdown all year. So, like I said, I think that they're going to try to get him a little bit more involved, especially if knowing Mac Jones is going to probably be the starter all year, or for the rest of the season. They're going to try to get him involved early on. He's been one of the more consistent pieces. Brian Thomas has been really good this year, but he's had his ups and downs with Mac Jones. Evan Ingram just been that consistent guy throughout since Mac Jones has started or has played for them, getting targets and receptions. Next up, I'm going to go with Marquez Valdez-Scantling. Since these last 3 weeks with the Saints, he's more that boomer bust guy, but with the bye week and all that, and this basically being in the last week for playoffs. So, like, if you're a team that is a fringe playoff team, you don't know if you're going to make it. MVS, I mean, he's been consistent. He's had 4 touchdowns in the last 3 games. Granted, he's had 3, 2, and 2 on his receptions. One 3 weeks ago for 3 catches, 109 yards. 2 touchdowns. 2 weeks ago, 2 catches, 87 yards and a touchdown. Last week, 2 receptions, 36 yards and a touchdown. He's been that big play guy, and the reason why it's worked out so far this season for him is not just because he's the best wide receiver on the roster. I mean, I think technically he is with no Shaheed and no Olave for the rest of the year. But the Saints have been a lot of short plays, a lot of running to Alvin Kamara. MVS has been in there on those play actions, and I think teams just kind of, once they start honing in on Kamara, that's when they break off that play action and they get Marquez on those deep shots. So I expect them to keep on taking him. He gets about 2 to 3 shots every game, and so far up to this point, he's had at least one of them go his way. 3 weeks ago, 2 of his 3 catches that were touchdowns were big plays, and I don't expect him to change, especially with this Kubiak offense. They've been doing a lot more play actions, getting Kamara involved. And like I said, once they start going down and really loading up the box and leaving MVS one-on-one, that's when they've been taking those shots. And lastly, I'm going to go with Chase Brown. Chase Brown these last couple of weeks has really taken over as the RB1, not just because of injuries, but just how he's been able to perform really well. He's also going against the Cowboys defense, who has 21 rushing touchdowns up to this point, 1,771 rushing yards, which is the 4th worst in the NFL. But Chase Brown, I mean, he's a guy that he should be getting a lot of touches here. Like I said, he should, the last probably 3 to 4 weeks has really solidified himself as the RB1 up to this point. Ever since against Las Vegas, I'd say, where he had 27 rush attempts, which was a season high, may have actually been a career high. But for 120 yards with 5 receptions for 37 yards and a touchdown, since then, against Baltimore, the Chargers, and Pittsburgh, all pretty good run defenses. He has two rushing touchdowns in those games. He only has 42, 86, and 70 rushing yards, but they're on the receiving side. One of the games against Baltimore, 9 receptions for 52, 5 receptions for 57, 3 receptions for 30. I mean, he's been solid these last 4 weeks, and like I said, he's really grown into that uh, RB1 role there. I don't really know what's going on with Zach Moss. I don't remember if he's injured or not, but he just hasn't been really being used. And I forgot someone else. One of the other running backs they have on their roster just hit the IR as well, so it opens up even more possibilities for Chase Brown.
Yeah, so my first start is going to be Kirk Cousins, my good old Kirk Cousins. I love Kirk Cousins. Obviously, everybody knows I'm a big Kirk Cousin fan, and I probably will be a Kirk Cousin fan for the rest of my life, even though he's been kind of struggling a little bit, especially as of late. Everybody knows that, right? Everybody's expecting him to. I wouldn't say necessarily expecting him to like get benched, but I think there's an expectation down the line that potentially he can get benched, and I just don't really see that happening. I mean, I understand like where you're coming from, but you got to also understand that there's going to be some natural growing pains. And even at this point in the season, I think people should kind of get back into the realm that realizing that, hey, Kirk Cousins is a really good quarterback. And he's 36 coming off an Achilles injury, and he's still trying to get familiarized with the offense. And on top of that, the Falcons have never done a great job of utilizing their weapons, right? We've seen that with Bijan. We've seen that with Drake London, Kyle Pitts. Like they've just never done a good job of that. It doesn't matter who their coach is. They've always struggled with that. On top of that, Kirk Cousins is throwing to good, talented players, don't get me wrong, but he's in a far worse situation talent wise than he was in Minnesota. He had arguably one of the best, if not the best player in all of football in Justin Jefferson, Jordan Addison, a stud, TJ Hawkinson. Now he's stuck with guys like Drake London, Ray McLeod, Kyle Pitts, who are NFL players, don't get me wrong, but not to the level where Kirk Cousins was kind of bailed out a lot of times watching a lot of Vikings games. But this is his return to Minnesota. Obviously, Minnesota was not willing to pay him the money that he got. I think a lot of people were kind of realizing now that it wasn't a good deal for, Atlanta, at least in the moment. But I think he kind of has a revenge game. It's been a period of time since he's really kind of stepped up and had a good game. The last game that I can really remember was back in week 9, and then week 8 before that against Tampa Bay, whose 2 games against Tampa Bay have been his best games of the season by a long shot. Going up against Minnesota, I think it's a favorable matchup, and I think this could be a high scoring shootout between, the youth and Sam Darnold per se, and the veteran in Kirk Cousins, who spent a good chunk of time of his career there and really made a name for himself in Minnesota. Secondly, I think this is an obvious one, but it's going to be Isaac Guerendo. Now, Isaac Guerendo was rostered in 1% of leagues. He's now rostered in 64.8% of leagues. Obviously, that big jump as everyone was expecting with Christian McCaffrey and Jordan Mason hitting IR. They did pick up Israel Abakanda from the Jets off of waivers. Now, even though I think Izzy will get some repetitions in the future weeks, I'm not too sure it's going to be this week because he just recently got picked up. Like, you got to learn a whole new offense, things like that. And Isaac Guerendo is where they really want to kind of have their running game go through. On top of that, he's also ran a little bit this season, 42 carries for 246 yards, which is almost averaging 6 yards per carry with 2 touchdowns, 5 for 19 receiving. Honestly, as a rookie, that's got to be pleasing for the San Francisco 49ers. You know they love their big ball threat in Christian McCaffrey, but since he's gone down, this is going to be an opportunity for Kyle Shanahan to really see if Guerendo could be that number 2 or number 3 piece moving forward. I think Jordan Mason's contract's up after this year. There's always questions with Elijah Mitchell. You never know what you're going to get. And since the 49ers are basically out of it and injuries continue to stack upon each other, I think Isaac Guerendo is going to be one of those guys where he has the opportunity to really step up and be a contributing piece. But I think more than anything, it's kind of a tryout for next year. On top of that, they're going to do a matchup with Chicago. They have 3 of their final 5 games at home: the Bears, the Rams, Dolphins, Lions, and the Cardinals. So it'll be interesting to see how those games turn out. But I think now with the lead role, you're going to be able to see a lot more of what a lot of people saw out of Guerendo and what the 49ers saw out of Guerendo going into the draft. And finally, I'm going to go with Jonnu Smith. I think this has officially been a start now for obviously the last 3 weeks: 28.1, 23.7, and 21.1. I was listening to a podcast today, actually a Dynasty podcast, and they were talking about the fact that Tua seems to really be getting rid of the ball sooner now with all the concussions that he's taken. And typically when you're getting rid of the ball sooner, you're not throwing to deep ball threats like Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle because they take time to obviously establish the routes. But Now they're kind of dumping it off to guys like Jonnu Smith, right? Like the tight ends, getting the tight ends involved. And I think that's really going to continue here. Got a matchup against the Jets. Obviously, the Jets are out of it. The Jets are looking for a win. It's at Miami, which is a lot better of a situation for Miami as opposed to being at Green Bay. But even at Green Bay, where Tua was kind of at his most vulnerable as far as not health, obviously, but being healthy at his most vulnerable. I mean, he looked to guys like Jonnu Smith, who had his highest reception and yard total. He didn't have a touchdown, but he had 10 catches for 113 yards. That's 6, 9, and 10 receptions, 87, 101, 113 yards last games. On top of that, with 3 touchdowns, I think this is an obvious must start. If you don't have him on your team, you probably should pick him up. Again, 77.2% roster, which means he's basically available in 1/4 of leagues, which is crazy to think about at this point in the season. And he's the 5th ranked position tight end, which I know nobody was expecting going into this season. What about sits?
First, I'm going to go with Gus Edwards. With J.K. Dobbins hitting IR, I think a lot of people went out picked up Gus Edwards. This is not the week to start him. He's going against the Chiefs, which is the second best run defense in the NFL. Just giving up over 1,000 yards up to this point. Only 9 rushing touchdowns, very solid there. And Gus Edwards, I mean, he hasn't had a lot of run just because of the emergence of J.K. And him being injured a little bit. But he's not a receiving back. He has 2 receptions all year up to this point. He just has never been a good receiving back in his career. And he also only has 238 rushing yards on 69 attempts and 1 rushing touchdown. He just hasn't been that good all year. Yes, he's taken the backseat to JK, but Edwards, like going against one of the top run defenses who doesn't give up many touchdowns, give up less than 1 rushing touchdown a game, gives up less than 100 total rushing yards to opposing teams per game. Edwards, who just doesn't give you much receiving upside, can be a big problem there. I honestly don't understand why people go out and pick him up and expect to start him because JK's out. Gus Edwards just hasn't been that good all year. And even when he has had a little bit more opportunities, like games where he's had 18 carries for 58 yards against Carolina, which is one of the worst run defenses, against Tennessee, 10 for 55, 11 for 26. Just last week, 6 for 32, and he only had 1 reception for 1 yard in that game. Next up, I'm going to go with Nick Chubb. Nick Chubb these last couple weeks has been fantasy relevant. 2 weeks ago against the Steelers, he had those 2 touchdowns. So solid game. He had a solid game there, a game that I really didn't project that he would have. And then this past week against the Broncos, he had a little bit better. Not as good as 2 weeks ago, but still had a solid week. Through the air, he had one bigger play, 2 receptions, 24 yards. But he took a really big step backwards in this last game. We've seen over 10 rush attempts per game, especially the last couple of weeks, 20, 11, 15, and just dropped to 9. And yes, I know Jameis threw for 450 yards and had like almost 50 pass attempts in this game. But Chubb just really hasn't done a whole lot. He had that 2 touchdown game against the Steelers, and in this game with the Browns, they're going against one of the better defenses. They're playing the Steelers again. I think the Steelers are going to hone in on Nick Chubb. I think they kind of, I wouldn't say forgot about him, but they weren't playing him like it's Nick Chubb. They were projecting him to play like how they've seen the rest of the year, and they kind of got lazy on run defense. I don't expect them to do that. Yes, they're still going to have to hone in on Jameis. I would assume it's probably going to be another snow game. Or potentially or a colder game, maybe not a snow game because it is a 10 o'clock game at this point. But yeah, I don't think Nick Chubb's going to be able to repeat going back to back games against the Steelers, where he's going to have 2 touchdowns and be super fantasy relevant and have a bigger role. And then Chuba Hubbard's going to be my last sit. Going against the Eagles defense, one of the top run defenses in the NFL, only 8 rushing touchdowns given up to this point. A little bit over 1,200 rushing yards given up in total. Chuba, one of the big things, he's been great all year. He's someone who I really liked, and I thought that he would emerge a little bit more like how he has been, especially the way he ended last year. But yes, last week with that big fumble at the end of the game versus Tampa, I know that he sat on like this on the bench for like another half an hour after the game, just sitting there just thinking about it. I think they're going to try to get him involved early on again. But against top run defenses, he really hasn't been great. He was solid against Kansas City getting into the end zone. But outside of that, when you go against some of the better defenses, run defenses like Denver, 15 for 56, two receptions for 15 yards. Uh, and just as a whole, they haven't really faced many good run defenses outside of KC and Denver. You have to go back to week 2, I believe it was, with 10 rush attempts for 64 yards, 4 catches for 12 yards against the Chargers. But outside of that, they played New Orleans twice. It hasn't been that good on the ground. They've been a better run defense. Tampa Bay held them to only 43 yards. And like I said, they also had that fumble at the end of the game that basically lost it for him. But Chuba, I mean, he's been great all year. He's been a good fantasy option for a lot of teams. I think he's in like the top 15 for running backs and fantasy rankings as right now. But against top run defenses, we've seen at least top 10 run defenses. He hasn't produced over 60 yards, and I think he only has 1 touchdown.
So for my 3, I'm going to go with 3 quarterbacks, and the first 2 are going to actually go hand in hand, so I'll talk about them both at the same time. But it's going to be Russell Wilson and Jameis Winston. Obviously, really weird games. Jameis Winston, just the GOAT for the amount of yards and touchdowns that he throws, as well as interceptions at the same time. 497 yards against Denver on Monday Night Football, 4 touchdowns and 3 interceptions. That equated to 32.98 fantasy points. I mean, that's just the epitome of Jameis Winston's life so far in the NFL. On the flip side, Russell Wilson had his best game of the season, going for 414 yards, 3 touchdowns, and 1 interception, 3 carries for those 3 yards, and 26.86 points. The bottom line is I think this is going to be a low-scoring game. Cleveland, Pittsburgh always seem to have those low-scoring affairs, and I think this one's going to be similar. I think the offenses are obviously rolling. They've been putting up a good amount of points, especially the last couple of weeks, but I think this is kind of where the defenses step up. Let's not forget, these are 2 premier defenses. I know injuries have obviously been a factor for both teams, but think of guys, at least to start the year in general and throughout the year, that have been on the team. Guys like Myles Garrett, right, on the Browns. TJ Watt, two of the best defensive players, probably the 2 best defensive players in all of football. Maybe Dexter Lawrence has a little bit to say this season, but from top to bottom, the defenses are really solid. And I think Cleveland did have a couple of injuries there against Denver, but I haven't seen too many, prognoses where I'm too worried. It's going to be a low scoring game. I would imagine this game to be a 16-13 type game. And I think if there is any effects, if there's anything that I would bet on, it's going to be the running game. So I think these 2 weeks that these quarterbacks had were good. Don't get me wrong, but I think they're also a little bit showy. I think as we move forward here, they're going to be spotty, and how much can you really trust them? Russell is rostered in 51% of leagues, and Jameis Winston 15. So if it's back-to-back weeks of good performances by both these quarterbacks, then I would consider adding them to the roster. And then finally, I'm going to go with Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray's had an up and down year. He's the 9th position ranked quarterback, averaging 17 points a game. Last week against Minnesota, 260 yards, 1 touchdown, 2 interceptions, 7 carries for 48 yards. If I'm being honest, I just haven't really seen the rushing value, especially as of late, of Kyler Murray. Really, since that Chargers game where he had 6 carries for 64 yards and a score, I haven't really been too excited to kind of see where Kyler Murray's been. Now they're going in at home. I understand that, but against the Seattle team that obviously puts up a lot of fight with them. The last time the Cardinals played Seattle was a week before they played Minnesota, and they had 6 points on offense. Kyler went 285, 0, and 1. There's also a trend. I know it's hard to beat the same opponent twice, but you typically see the same performances from guys unless they just completely shoot through a roof and have, a good game in the game 1 or second game, whatever it is. I just don't see that happening, especially with Kyler. And I think once Kyler gets back to his rushing value and really kind of showcases his rushing talent a little bit more, I know he had 2 rushing touchdowns in week 10, but since then he hasn't really been carrying the ball for a lot of yardage, has been really trying to focus on the air attack, and it's led to more interceptions. So I think the Cardinals as a whole, they got a tough challenge, even though it's at home against Seattle. Again, this could be another low-scoring affair. You never know what you're going to get against Geno. We obviously had that streak where Geno had thrown an interception for 8 straight weeks. Could continue, could not, but I think Kyler's a set. All right, what about sleepers?
Tyron Tracy Jr. He's really came out of nowhere, I would say. First couple weeks, his most carries were 5 start the year, and then once he's gone over 10 rush attempts a game, those are when you see him have his bigger games. 18 for 129, no with 1 reception for 1 receiving yard, no touchdown that game. 17 carries, 50 yards, a touchdown there. 6 receptions, 57 yards. 20 rush attempts for 145, rushing touchdown there, 2 receptions for 5 yards, and 66 yards and 16 rush attempts, only 1 catch, and 18 rush attempts for 103 with a rushing touchdown. but we really haven't seen him have a lot of those double-digit rush attempt games. We've only seen him have 5 up to this point. Last 2 weeks, he's been at 9-9. I expect him to go over, especially against the Saints run defense, who's been horrid all year. On 1,632 rushing yards with 15 rushing touchdowns. This could be a game that we see Tracy get over those, get into that double-digit rush attempts, be right around 15 to uh, 18, be somewhere in that range, get you 90, around 90 rushing yards, probably 2 receptions in this game, and wouldn't be surprised if he got into the end zone. This is also another game with Drew Lock going to be at the starting quarterback position. The first game they had that was against Dallas, where he did have a touchdown that game, 2 receptions, 33 yards, 9 rush attempts for 32 yards. So not a great game if you take away the touchdown, but with the touchdown there, he would have been a good RB2 play or flex play there. But like I said, the Saints' rush defense has been horrible all year. They're bottom 10 in the NFL in rushing yards and rushing touchdowns given up at this point. Tracy's just one of those guys who really wasn't on my board coming to the draft, but has had a really good rookie year up to this point, especially being a 5th-round pick and just kind of turning his season around. Next up, Calvin Ridley going against Jacksonville. I was going to put Will Levis here, but I couldn't give you the happiness or joy of putting Will Levis as a sleeper. So I'm going to go with Calvin Ridley here.
Fair
Ridley
enough.
going against the Jaguars, divisional opponent here, so usually a little bit more difficult, but if it is a closer game, Calvin Ridley, I expect to be that number 1 receiving target. And with that, Jacksonville, their pass defense is horrible. It hasn't been good all year. With that, also Calvin Ridley, if I remember correctly, spent a brief time there in Jacksonville. It's kind of I wouldn't say a revenge game because he didn't play much there, but he's going back and playing his former team. Especially these last couple of weeks, we've seen the targets be there 7, 6, 6, and 9. 2 of those games having 84, 92, 93 rushing or receiving yards. One of those games having 2 touchdowns. He only has 3 touchdowns all year. This would be another one I wouldn't be surprised if he gets in the end zone. Has maybe 4 catches for 60, 70 yards. Not a huge game, but a guy who you can definitely throw as your wide receiver too with the bye weeks or into your flex position. Someone who has been inconsistent, but we've known Calvin Ridley to be like that. Not super consistent, but just out of nowhere, he can have those big games where he has 6 receptions, 100 yards, and receiving touchdown. And last up, I'm going to go with Jacoby Myers. Jacoby Myers has quietly had a really good year up to this point. Jacoby Myers going against the Buccaneers, not a great pass defense here. They've given up the 3rd most passing yards at 3,325, 21 passing touchdowns to 5 interceptions. Aiden O'Connell will be back at quarterback there. Really had a solid game against the Chiefs on Black Friday, but kind of that mistiming snap, fumble at the end of the game won the game for the Chiefs at the end of the day. But Myers, like I said, really quietly has had a good year. It didn't really matter who he's at quarterback between Minshew and O'Connell. Has almost 700 yards, 60 receptions, 2 touchdowns. But with O'Connell these last 2 weeks, against Denver, 10 receptions, 121 yards. Last week against the Chiefs, 6 receptions for 97. There's been a really good connection there. And like I said, with the Buccaneers defense line, the 3rd most passing yards, 21 touchdowns, 5 interceptions. Not a great ratio there. I don't see Myers getting to the end zone, but I could definitely see him having a game between that Denver and Kansas City one, especially 2 divisional opponents. It's just tough to go against. This is a non-divisional opponent. Being right around that 7 reception, pushing 80, 90 yards. I wouldn't be too surprised. O'Connell and him have had a really good connection dating back to O'Connell's rookie year last year. He's gotten the targets. That's one of the big things with Myers. And Myers doesn't really have many drops. I think I saw something that he has 1 drop this year. I think it was maybe last week or 2 weeks ago. But before that, he had the entire streak of 10 plus games without recording a drop. And he just got his first one. I want to say it was either last week or 2 weeks ago.
So for my 3 sleepers, the first is going to be Mac Jones. Obviously, it's the Mac era in Jacksonville. Trevor Lawrence did hit IR today. I know that hurts you in Dynasty a little bit, but hey, good thing you got Tua. But yeah, Mac Jones, hasn't looked great, to be honest, with Mac Jones. I was expecting kind of like a career bounce back per se, especially when he first started in Jacksonville, coming from the New England Patriots for like a sixth rounder or something like that. Hasn't looked too splendid in the two games that he played in. Obviously, in Minnesota, 111 yards, 2 interceptions, and then the next week at Detroit, 138, 1 interception. But last week when he came in for Lawrence, 20 for 32, 235, and 2 scores. I mean, not too bad, especially for a guy like Mac Jones. Biggest thing going into this matchup is opportunity, right? They're going into Tennessee, sure, but Tennessee is also 3-9. Tennessee is not really competing for anything as well. I think there's a lot of areas on Tennessee that you need to kind of fix. I think you can keep the Hall of Fame quarterback and Will Levis, don't get me wrong, but I think the defense could use some work. I think the offensive line is a big thing that they need to address, but regardless, I think there's a lot of opportunity for Mac Jones to have success, get his receivers involved, and kind of move on the right path forward. It's kind of a deep sleeper though, but he could be somebody you roster knowing that he'll be the starting quarterback unless, injuries happen, things like that. I really doubt they go to the Iowa legend in CJ Beathard at the end. Secondly, I'm going to go with Jacoby Myers. Now, Jacoby Myers is a guy that I've had my eye on for a period of time. He's rostered in 79.7% of leagues. Last week at Kansas City, 6 catches, 97 yards in the day for 15.7 fantasy points. The week before that, 22.1 fantasy points, 10 catches, 121 yards. I feel like he's due for a touchdown, and the numbers that he's been putting up have been really kind of eye-opening. He's a guy that seems to be really the only main target on that Raiders team. I know obviously there's some other guys that people have their eye on, like Trey Tucker, and Brock Bowers, obviously, but I feel like Jacoby Myers has kind of solidified himself as the wide receiver one on that team, especially with Devontae Adams departing. So looking at that from top to bottom, I think Jacoby Myers is set for another big week at Tampa Bay, which again, Tampa's been spotty as well. I think this could potentially be a high scoring game, even though it's the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Raiders. As you mentioned, Aiden O'Connell showed a lot of promise in a really good game last week, especially against Kansas City on Black Friday. And finally, I'm going to go with Bryce Young. Now, Bryce Young obviously has kind of had a reboot in his career ever since he's been benched. He's really done a good job, which is obviously something you love to see, especially for a guy like Bryce Young. Last week was his best fantasy week of the season, and it wasn't even close. 298 yards and 1 score, 3 rushes, 17 yards and a score as well. I think the biggest thing for Bryce Young has been comfortability. He's had a really good job of kind of settling in and having some success, and I think that's really going to continue, even though they are going into Philadelphia. I mean, Philadelphia is good, don't get me wrong, but their defense has been prone to quarterbacks like Bryce Young at a time. And Adam Thielen had a resurging game. Xavier Legette's looked good. Even some other guys on the team as well. So there's a lot of things to be excited about with this Carolina Panthers team. And I think going into Philadelphia, they're going to be completely counted out. But don't turn your head on a guy like Bryce Young, especially if you're in a deeper league and need a quarterback, because the last 3 weeks have been the three best weeks that Bryce Young's had in his not professional career, but his season thus far. And the biggest thing in fantasy, it seems, time and time again, especially at the quarterback position, is momentum. And I would ride the Bryce Young momentum, even if it's temporary, for these next week or two. All right, what about Bus?
First one we have Adam Thielen. Just as the Eagles' pass defense has been really good, especially in the slot with Cooper DeJean being with the highest pass defensive backs. His defensive rating on balls thrown his way is one of the highest in the NFL, especially these last couple of weeks. But Thielen had his breakout game last week of the season, had a season high on receptions, yards, targets, has got a touchdown that game. He was 10 targets, 8 receptions, 99 yards, and a touchdown there. Had an amazing one-handed grab. I saw that towards the end of the game. It was like a fourth down. It was like 4th and 3. Had this really good one-handed catch that kept him in it. Obviously, they didn't win that game because Chuba Hubbard fumbled there at the end of the game. But he had a really good game, but I just don't expect it, especially being lined up more in the slot against Cooper DeJean, against his pass defense, who's been really good all year. They've given him the third least amount of passing yards at 2,403. Total passing yards given up. Only 13 touchdowns to 7 interceptions through the air. Their QBR given up is only 83.5, so really good there. They also get a lot of pressure to the quarterback, and that's when Bryce Young has been a little bit better this year. He's been more mobile, keeping his eyes down the field, be able to find his guys. But he also hasn't faced many really good pass defenses, pass rush defenses, and then pass protection defenses at the same time. It's not like this Eagles defense is not used to having to guard guys an extra 3 to 4 seconds because the quarterback was scrambling in the pocket. That's where they thrive the most, especially where they got most of their interceptions up to this point in his year, is getting that quarterback out of the pocket and having him make those dump throws. Next up, we have DJ Moore. DJ Moore's been so up and down. He started off the year so cold, and then had a really good game. I think I want to say he had like 10 receptions, over 100 yards and a touchdown there, like 4 week or 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago now, up to this point. And he's had decent games, especially his last 2 weeks. He's had two really good games. Had 16 targets last week versus Detroit, 8 receptions, 97 yards, a touchdown. 2 weeks ago against Minnesota, 7 receptions, 106 yards and a touchdown. But those were two divisional games. I mean, against divisional opponents, you always see the best come out of these players. I mean, they want to compete in their division, even though they're not in it like Chicago is. Competing in the division is always big, even if you lose. If you just make it a good game, really helps out. They're also going to San Francisco. San Francisco's been quietly one of the better pass defenses, mainly because they've been losing a lot more. So teams have just kind of been running out the clock. But they give up the fourth least amount of passing yards at 2,416. Only 15 passing touchdowns, 11 interceptions, so a great ratio there. Their number one wide receivers on a lot of these teams. I wouldn't say they've shut them down, but it made them a lot more quiet. And DJ Moore's inconsistency throughout this year, I really have to question it. I know Caleb Williams has been playing a lot better, but with Caleb Williams, we've already seen him have that hot 4 game stretch earlier this year, and then go quiet for 4 weeks and not throw a single touchdown or rush for a single touchdown. I'm not saying that's going to happen this week with Caleb Williams, but you gotta expect it to come at least at some point where he has another down game, and then he goes another week or two without having any touchdowns. It's kind of just this trend that we've seen out of Caleb Williams. And one of the big things as well, I forgot who it was, one of the coaches last week, or no, it's Dan Campbell talking about Caleb Williams, is that he doesn't slide or go out of bounds. So he's one big hit away from them going to their backup quarterback because, like he said, he doesn't slide, he doesn't go out of bounds. So he's telling these guys, just go out and hit him because you know he's not going to go down and you're not going to get that penalty. And lastly, I would say Cooper Kupp overall, but Puka slash Cooper Cup, they haven't been good in the past game with both of them. I think I mentioned this a few times that it's always just one of them that has a big good game. And it seems like up to this point, Cooper Cup's been the guy taking the back seat to Puka Nakua. I know I want to say 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, he had two touchdowns, 106 yards. But what really saved him in that game is I think it was like the first or second play coming into halftime. He had like a 60-something yard touchdown to start off the third quarter. That really saved him in that game. Up to that point, yes, he still had a touchdown, but he only had like 30 yards. Against Philly, 8 receptions, 60 yards, a touchdown. And last week against New Orleans, only 6 targets, 3 receptions for 17 yards. I mean, we've seen the inconsistencies with both of them being on the field, but Puka Nakua, I mean, just the way that they use them, they've been using him more in motion. When I was watching them play, whenever Puka went in motion, they actually were throwing the ball. Whenever Cup went in motion, it seemed like they were always running the ball. They weren't really scheming up Puka to get in motion and go out for passes because that's where we've seen him thrive. Or have some of his best games since seeing him thrive is when when he's in motion, we seem to move around and not be able to get pressed off the line. It seems like that's what they've been doing with Puka a lot more, and they've been using Cup as more of like a blocking wide receiver when they move him around, and just more of a decoy than an actual weapon.
My first is going to be Jawan Johnson, a Saint. I know he's dealing with a little bit of an injury right now, but other than that, I mean, obviously Taysom Hill lost for the year. I believe it was a torn ACL and something with a PCL, if I'm not
ACL.
mistaken. Just ACL, okay. But regardless, Taysom Hill is out. I know he classifies as a tight end. He's not your typical tight end, right? He throws, he runs, he does it all. Really fun to watch. I'm glad the Saints utilized him so long ago, it seems like, to that role. But a lot of people are expecting maybe Jawan Johnson to be the next man up, not to do what Taysom Hill does, because nobody can compete with what Taysom Hill does, but be more, I think, active in the passing game. I just don't really see that happening. I know the last couple of weeks he's been kind of mediocre. 5 receptions, 36 yards. Week before that, 3 for 30 and a score. I just am not trusting it. That's the end of the day. I think Taysom Hill brings a different versatility to the tight end position, just not many people are expecting. And as you mentioned, obviously, the Saints as a whole, like there's just a lot of questions on their team, particularly in that offense at certain positions. And I just don't see Derek Carr and Jawan Johnson really having a connection that's worthwhile. Secondly, I'm going to go with Blake Corum. Blake Corum had the highest carry total of the season last week, 8 for 42, but nothing other than that. I think that was kind of a little bit of a I wouldn't say luck, but it's just interesting because he obviously is a guy that is a running back too. And with the Los Angeles Rams, it seems like with Sean McVay, it's only running back one. A lot of teams go to the two running back system. Sean McVay does not. And I think people are maybe a little bit excited to see the 8 carries for 42 yards, but I really don't see Blake Corum getting the opportunity unless Kyron Williams goes down or maybe 3 years down the line. And by that point, it might be a little bit too late. Hard to draft running backs in LA, especially with Sean McVay. And I think that's going to continue moving forward. And then finally, I'm going to go with Jalen Tolbert. Now, Jalen Tolbert, again, week 12 against Washington, 2 for 22 and a touchdown. Last week, 2 for 41. He's had a bunch of games of 2 and 3. And the biggest thing that I realized with Jalen Tolbert is he's a good receiver when Dak Prescott's the starting quarterback, not Cooper Rush. I know Brandon Cooks recently came back from IR as well, which kind of limits his opportunity to have success. So really looking at the wide receiver position, it's Brandon Cooks, CeeDee Lamb, and hopefully getting Jake Ferguson back this week. Jalen Tolbert seems to be kind of one of those guys that was kind of an early season kind of sleeper that nobody was talking about, and now has kind of ventured to the position where nobody's talking about him because he hasn't really stepped up to the plate. And you can't get that one touchdown every 4 or 5 weeks and expect to be fantasy relevant, especially in this big of a week as it is with week 14 and it being, for most leagues, the final week of the regular season. Thank you guys for listening to another episode here in The Truth. If you guys did enjoy it, make sure you follow The Truth on Twitter, The Truth as one, to stay up to date with the latest information regarding The Truth, including podcast dates, podcast uploads, and other important information you don't want to miss. Make sure you guys also follow The Truth on Instagram and TikTok at the.tt.truth. Are you looking to find a drink that offers peak hydration, raises your energy levels, speeds up your recovery, and keeps your mind sharply focused in memory? Look no further than Acid Rainwater. I'm excited to partner with Bloodline Sports, AZ, and Acid Rainwater, which focuses on peak hydration and productivity while also maintaining ecosystem-friendly product. Use code HESSON15, that's HESSON15 for 15% off every purchase. As always, I'm your host, the one you love the most, Niall Hesson, joined once again by AJ Ponciano. Take care and good night.